December 8th, 1941. Yesterday, the Empire of Japan conducted an aerial military exercise near the American territory of Hawaii. Despite heightening tensions between the two nations, the exercise concluded without incident. Japan's ambassador to the U.S., Kiichi Saburo Nomura, assured President Roosevelt that his country had no hostile intentions against the U.S. and pleaded for continued negotiations on bilateral trade.
Japan's attack on the American naval base, Pearl Harbor, was one of the most devastating acts of violence to ever occur on American soil. Had Japan not bombed Pearl Harbor, the course of history would have been changed forever. The cries for peace on America's behalf would have been answered, considering the negotiations with Japanese ambassador Kiichi Saburo Nomura went well. Roosevelt would have been assured that there were no hostile intentions against the U.S. Without the bombing of Pearl Harbor, America would have had no means of intervening in World War II. If America had not been provoked by Japan, they would not have interfered, but would have watched Europe and the East fend for themselves. World War II had a huge impact on American domestics, most strongly affecting the economy, civil rights movements, and the American culture as a whole. The bombing of Pearl Harbor allowed America to have an entry into the war, and without this entry, America would have stood as isolationists, greatly changing our history.
World War II left a huge mark on the American economy. It touched on nearly every aspect, most importantly, employment rates. With the raise in employment rates, all else followed, leading to a successful war and post-war period. The economy was jump-started and mobilized by the war. The government saw war as the perfect time to get out of the Great Depression, and they capitalized on this opportunity. Industries such as wartime manufacturing and the revival of old industries assisted the government in squeezing out every ounce they could get. Employment. The scale of production skyrocketed due to all of the items being needed in war, ranging from tanks to guns. The raw need for people to work in these assembly lines brought jobless people in off the streets, but this is only half the story. Because the people that were supposed to be working these jobs went off to war, the demand for labor went up even higher. The combination of these two effects yielded the chipping away at unemployment rates. As aforementioned, with the rise in employment, all else follows, including spending money on other businesses. Similar to any war, World War II created thousands of jobs, ultimately bringing America out of the depths of the Great Depression. Without the bombing of Pearl Harbor, America would have had no way to enter such a war without seeming justified. Without the war, it is doubtful that such a successful rebound from one of the most disastrous times in American history would have ever occurred. It is unrealistic to believe that such a cataclysmic event like World War II would have occurred, thus creating hundreds of thousands of jobs. Because the American people were assured of secure jobs, they had the confidence to go out and spend their money on American businesses. This time period of growth validates the success of Keynesian economics. Similar to World War I, America emerged with a reinvigorated economy. It is difficult to say that the attack on Pearl Harbor was positive, but from an economic standpoint it was. Had America not entered the war, it would have continued to stagnate in the Great Depression under Roosevelt's administration.
With war industries rapidly expanding as a result to the entrance of America into World War II, jobs were rapidly expanding as well. During World War II, the modern civil rights movement was born. African Americans were enraged because of their near absolute exclusion from jobs in these industries, and also because of the persistence of lynching at the time. This was a kickstart to the spotlight in America on civil rights, and without our entry to World War II, civil rights and its progression and advancement through history, as we know it, would have never developed so vigorously. Said to be one of the first, if not the first, civil rights march on Washington, the March of Black Laborers demanded access to defense employment, a national anti-lynching law, and an end to segregation. Declarations by many laborers at the time described racial discrimination as un-American and pro-Hitler. Without any of the above events having taken place, Roosevelt would have never issued Executive Order 8802, which banned discrimination in defense jobs and established the FEPC, the Fair Employment Practices Commission, to monitor compliance. Even though the FEPC lacked strength regarding the enforcement of its policies, without it, there would have been no model of a shift in public policy to create the spark for civil rights movements to come. An example of the impact all of this had on the spirits of African Americans is the apparently immediate expansion of associations focused on achieving equality for African Americans in society. For example, the fact that the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, grew tenfold from 50,000 to 500,000 in very little time seems to have served as a model of the newly backed passion of African Americans in the society. In addition, without America's involvement in the war, African Americans would not have realized the lack of civil rights as blatantly because themes like Double V, which stands for Victory over Germany and Japan, must be accompanied by victory over segregation at home, would not have helped bring problems to light. This theme of fighting for freedom abroad but not at home served as a centerpiece for African Americans during the war. Without American intervention into World War II, the civil rights movements, the most famous led by Martin Luther King Jr., would have ultimately been delayed.
World War II created an atmosphere where American culture became almost unrecognizable. As a whole, America became unified. They were encouraged to buy war bonds, work longer hours, and participate in federal defense drills. Prior to this, there was a big question of the role of immigrants. But because of the war, anybody that could pass as an American who supported the efforts overseas was accepted. Unfortunately, this rule did not apply to all ethnicities. The Japanese and Chinese continued to be persecuted nationwide. In fact, in 1942, the United States forced the relocation of all Japanese American people to 10 camps throughout the South. In previous administrations, the persecution of Eastern ethnicities was solved morally with legislation, but the forced relocation shows no decent solution. Another radical change was the redefinition of the woman's role. Before the war, a woman was looked upon as a housewife to deal with the cooking and cleaning. Illustrations such as Rosie the Riveter show how much a woman's role changed. She was now the strong woman with the ability to work, a complete redefinition of previously held beliefs. On a whole, America was much more upbeat. Whether or not this was an effect from the prosperous economy, the mood in America was optimistic. Together they tormented the Eastern ethnicities, bought bonds, and saw their women rise to the occasion. Together they watched as America was revived right before their eyes. These are all direct results from the war. Without such a war, the American people could not come together and evolve in such a way they did. American culture would have been much different without the war. Women would have remained the stereotypical housewife, the Japanese and Chinese could quietly live out their lives, and American people would not share a common goal, unifying one another. Whether it was for the better or for the worse, the war changed American culture.
Had the United States never been provoked by Japan and virtually given no option but to enter World War II, America would not be the same as it is today. First off, the substantial changes which led toward a prosperous economy would have had no spine and base to take place. Secondly, the modern civil rights movement as we know it today would have had nothing to shed light on the ethical problems taking place on our soil. And lastly, the radical changes which gave birth to a never-before-seen new type of society and American culture would have not had momentum until further years to come. All three themes, as a whole, represent the relevance of causality regarding the Japanese bombardment of Pearl Harbor and the American entry into World War II. History would have been rewritten.
It's the Rock in the building. Khalid.